The wonderful world of technology. Hi, I'm Sandy O'Sullivan. I'm an associate professor in creative industries and I work alongside Claire and your tutors. I'm here to talk specifically about the music and sound journeys, narratives, but also other kinds of utterances. And I do this every year, and usually, of course, I do it face to face. But what I'm going to do is just break this up into a few different videos. And I'm also doing the one on film and screen representation in a few weeks. So we'll come back and revisit some of this at that stage. I've posted up a whole lot of links, and you'll see it in a Word document that just redirects you to some of those mostly YouTube videos just to make it accessible. I'll have a note on what I've done with those YouTube videos in a bit, but I should start by acknowledging the always owners of the land on which we're meeting today. Your location, my location. I'm here in an area that to some people is contested, but certainly has a long association with Kabi Kabi people. And you are not sure. So acknowledging that is a really important part of the work that we do, and I'm sure Claire's covered off on that if you weren't too clear on it yourself. I'm an Aboriginal person. I'm a Wiradjuri person. That's Wiradjuri. So although I do say it like it starts with an R. As I was saying, I usually do this in a kind of face-to-face setting. And we run it as a kind of lecture where you're hearing all of these pieces of music. I'm just going to play a short burst of each of them. And I'm going to, in this first one, just talk about a little bit of myth busting, but also a little bit of myth setting up. So probably the most persistent myth is that Aboriginal music only sounds one way, that it's a yidaki or didgeridoo, I guess, is the English language name for it. Didgeridoo. It's a made-up name by some white person at some stage. But it's a remarkable instrument, and it's a very important instrument for a lot of communities, but it comes from a very particular place in Australia, and it certainly doesn't come from Queensland, or at least not in the southeast where we are, and it doesn't come from, say, New South Wales or Victoria either. And so it wasn't used traditionally in those communities. However, it is now. And so some of the myth busting is the kind of challenging that instruments can only be used in some spaces, but also understanding that those myths often conflate, they often pan-indigenise. And that can be really tricky. So, one of the things that I try to do is to challenge those stereotypes and those ideas. And so just in this first around 10-minute vid, I'm just going to describe a little bit about how some of those challenges work. So the work that I do is across music. I've been a musician for about 40 years, so I'm in my mid-50s, and I was about to say 30 years, but it's longer, it's 10 years longer, and over that time, obviously, I've played in a lot of bands, and I've been involved in a whole lot of music, and what's happened with Aboriginal music over that time has been really quite transformative, but there's also been persistence over that time. We haven't just suddenly arrived. In fact, we haven't arrived at all. I think the myths are often around, even our own personal myths are often around what we know, and we often build them around that. And you know that from the kind of examination of writing that you've done so far in this course. So that we'll often begin with, the kind of three, I would say three pieces of music that people are really familiar with as I guess ideas that capture ideas about Aboriginal Australia, and so we have. So from little things, big things grow. And you know, people will, who you're hearing in background there is Kev Carmody, who's one of the writers of this, and the other one is Paul Kelly. Okay. So another piece of music that came from a pretty around the same time is. Okay, so that's Yothu Yindi with Treaty. So some of you will be old enough to remember it, or you've probably heard it at some stage. And then there's actually a really nice re-rendering of that by AB Original. And this isn't it. This is a different song. Okay. That's good that I managed to get that in. So that's January 26, which is a really and it's AB Original if you haven't heard it, but all of them represent a kind of political set of ideas. But it's not what all Aboriginal music is or has been. It's often what captures the mainstream imagination, and it's not always the same as the material that Aboriginal people are listening to. And I think that's a really important moment for us to understand, that the work that has become not just palatable but marketable and of interest to the broader population is really incredibly important work, as that is. But it's also often about what the rest of the population needs to understand about Aboriginal Australia. It's not necessarily what we're listening to. So I often trot out this story, and even though we have a lot more ground to cover, I'm just going to complete the arc with this for this vid. And that's just, I recall in the 80s when I was in bands, that we had some remarkable bands playing at the time. In particular, a band that some of you may know, and a band called Warumpi Band. So this is a... So Warumpi Band, that's My Island Home, and it's an amazing song. It really is, and it was this very poignant moment. It was then recaptured by Christine Anu, and really transformed a whole lot of ideas of belonging and place, and again in that mainstream kind of understanding of Aboriginal people. But I remember in the 80s having, flatmates say to me, I can't wait to go and see Warumpi Band. And these were people who really loved punk music. And I was really surprised. I thought, why are you so interested in a country band? And I was excited about it because I love country music. But, I was really kind of fascinated. And their line back to me was, they're not a country band, they're an Aboriginal band, and at the time I remember thinking, yeah, now I understand as you do, that of course they were both, they were a band that absolutely had country roots. Now, you'll see that there's a wonderful quote by Professor Bronwyn Carlson, that you've got listed up on that document that's got the links on it. So have a look there. But it's it's out of the academic journal Alternative. And she says, many Aboriginal Australians have participated in and take pleasure from country music. Country music has provided a vehicle for Aboriginal people to tell our stories and assert our connection to country. country, capital C, a term used to describe our ancestral land. Country music is often associated with such terms as redneck and hillbilly, and is often associated with white working class. However, Indigenous participation in the country music genre disrupts this assumption. Indigenous people, as both consumers and producers, derive a great deal of pleasure from the country music genre. It was what people grew up with in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or earlier actually too. And so it became a very important part of the Aboriginal journey, but it hasn't necessarily translated to an understanding of that in mainstream. And it's an example of where the writing and the material that's generated for one market and from that market is not always the same as the kind of broader pitch or even the broader interest. So I'll pick this up in the next video. Thanks.